Have you ever tried to give someone you care about this perfect, hard-won piece of advice, only to watch it just bounce right off them? Or maybe you've been on the other side, getting a lecture that just felt totally empty. It's that classic, timeless frustration of the generation gap. And today, we're going to dig into the philosophy of why wisdom is so incredibly hard to pass down.
So, let's just jump right into the heart of the problem with this really powerful idea from philosopher Omar Igan. Nobody understands from words alone. It sounds so simple, right? But that one sentence, wow, it explains so much about why we fail to connect with each other. And okay, that immediately raises a huge question. If just telling someone something doesn't work, then what does? I mean, how does humanity manage to learn and grow at all? Let's break it down.
All right, first up, we have to talk about the main tool we all use, language. We like to think of it as this perfect bridge from one mind to another, but it's got a really big fundamental flaw that gets in the way of real understanding. This right here reveals the huge gap in how we communicate. See, on one hand, we think we're handing over the actual key, the real, tangible, hard-won experience. But what the other person actually gets is more like a picture of the key. We're sending the data, sure, the basic concept, but not the lived-in feeling, not the emotional weight that makes that knowledge truly mean something.
So without that real-world context, all our profound warnings, all our life-changing advice, it can just sound like background noise. The source material uses the word tadavava, which basically means empty chatter. All the seriousness, all the urgency we feel, it just gets lost in translation. And this whole communication gap, it leads to a really fascinating and, yeah, maybe kind of frustrating truth about how human knowledge actually moves forward. It creates something you could call a generational reset.
We love to imagine progress as this beautiful, smooth upward curve. Each generation standing on the shoulders of the one before it, just building higher and higher. It's a really nice thought, but it's just not how it works. The reality is way, way messier. It's much more of a zigzag, because that feeling, that urgency of knowledge can't be perfectly passed on. Each new generation has to kind of stumble, fall, and rediscover a lot of the same core truths for themselves.
And it seems there's even a cycle to this. It takes roughly 80 years, about a full human lifetime, for what you could call a soft reset to happen. Because once the people with the direct lived experience of an era are gone, that experience just fades away into abstract history. So what this means is that for a new generation to truly get an old idea, whether it's a political movement or a social value, they have to become, for lack of a better term, mini archaeologists. They can't just be told where the treasure is buried, they have to pick up a shovel and dig for it themselves to understand what it's really worth.
Okay, so if lecturing doesn't work and words themselves are kind of flawed, what is the most powerful communication tool we actually have? Well, the answer is a total game changer. The answer really requires us to flip our whole way of thinking on its head. It shifts the focus away from what we say and puts it squarely on who we are. This brings us to this incredible concept of being a life option. An elder's greatest influence isn't their advice, it's their entire existence. A young person looks at them, at how they live, how they carry themselves, and they subconsciously ask, is that a life I would want? Is that a compelling option for my own future? That's the real communication that's happening. Philosopher Omar Igan actually gives this amazing personal example of his own mentor, the writer Tassin Yücel. He said Yücel didn't teach with these big, grand statements. He taught by treating his students with such profound respect that it actually shocked them into realizing their own potential. He embodied the lesson. He was the lesson. Now, this whole idea of actively rediscovering things for yourself, it doesn't just apply to you and me. It scales all the way up to entire cultures and how they decide to deal with their own history.
And you really see two completely different approaches here. On one side, you have cultures like the French that are constantly in conversation with their past, re-examining it, arguing with it, looking at it from new angles. But on the other side, you can have a culture of denial, one that prefers to just bury uncomfortable truths and act like they never happened.
This old Turkish proverb just nails that culture of denial. The arm is broken, but it stays within the sleeve. You hide the injury, you don't talk about it, and the problem with that approach is that it comes from a deep, deep lack of confidence. A fear that if we actually looked at the break, we wouldn't be strong enough to fix it. So where does all this leave us? We've established that we can't just download wisdom into someone else's brain, and that hiding from the past is a dead end.
This leads us to a really surprising but powerful conclusion. Once we admit our limitations, it forces us to be a little more humble. And maybe, instead of always trying to add more stuff, more advice, more rules, more noise, maybe the most powerful path forward is actually about removing things.
So what should we stop doing? Well, number one, stop the denial. We have to trust ourselves and the next generation that we're strong enough to face history head on. And second, stop rushing our kids. Young people need space. They need silence to put their own thoughts together. And our instinct to jump in and help by filling that silence, it usually just gets in their way.
And this leaves us with this final, really powerful question to think about. Maybe the path to wisdom isn't about collecting more answers to hand out. Maybe it's about creating a space for others to find their own answers by stopping the very things that are blocking their path. So instead of always asking, what should we do? Maybe the much better question is, what should we stop doing?